Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 43, chapter 43, entitled All Bad Things Come to an End. Midori was pretty sure that he woke up in a hospital bed, and even though his vision was spotty, mostly from the blinding light above him, he was still ashamed to admit that it took him longer than a moment to remember whether this was a foggy memory or the aftermath of the USJ, the sports festival, or a particularly rough night in Hosu. He groaned, trying to raise a hand to shadow his face, but he could only cause himself more discomfort upon disturbing the healing skin. Okay, definitely Hosu. Izuku? He could hear Kami's voice from the side, laced with emotional wetness that was starting to become more common. Oh, please, be all right. I cannot do this again. Midori struggled, trying to reach out to his mentor. Kami, what's going... Izuku! Midori! The teen flinched at the loud noise and yet rolled over on his side to try and shield himself from the light so he could open his eyes. Shoto? Ida? He could hear scrambling as he blinked to adjust the harsh whiteness of the hospital atmosphere. He was in the hospital bed, dressed in a scratchy gown with the uncomfortable rub of the bandages against his chest, arm, and leg, and his eyes had finally settled in his surroundings. He could make out both Todoroki and Ida practically hanging off of their hospital beds. Izuku, you're finally up. Todoroki all but shouted, leaning over the edge of his bed toward the waking boy beside him. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a train. Midori groaned again, his lungs creaking from rust. What happened? Ida piped up this time. What do you remember? Midori had to think long and hard. The hero killer saved me, and then you guys all showed up. He scared the shit out of me, and then I think he just stopped? I don't know, it's all pretty blurry after that. Todoroki and Ida shared a look. Saved you? Yeah, from Shigaraki. He said, casually as if it was the simplest thing in the world. When his friends did not respond in the same manner, he rambled further, his mind and filter still fairly muddy. That's where I figured the Nomu was taking me, so I crashed it. But when Shigaraki had showed up anyway, I thought I was going to... He shot up, ignoring the way his body screamed in protest at the jarring movement. A hand reached to his chest, clutching at his heart, about to burst from his ribs. His friends, his mentor, all cried out in concern, but he couldn't hear them over the thumping of blood in his ears, blood suddenly tainted with the rush of fear again. But I see you have something I want. How thoughtful of you. Maybe we can work something out after all. A tear escaped him, one held back from the absolute terror he tasted upon looking at Shigaraki's maniacal expression. See you soon, Midori Izuku. He thought that he was going to never see the outside world again. Todoroki had moved off of his bed, settling beside him with a hand on his back, rubbing softly. That woke Midori out of his trance, wiping away the evidence of weakness that escaped him. It's all right, Izuku. You don't have to tell us. He was going to take me with him. Back to the League. When the hero killer showed up, Shigaraki offered him a chance to escape, but he didn't. I don't think I'd be here if he left. A quiet moment passed where no one uttered a sound, all realizing just how close they'd come to sheer disaster. Ida was the first to speak. We should tell one of the pros about this, because if we didn't know, I doubt they somehow do. Yeah, I mean, the gnome was obviously a part of the League, but he hadn't expected for either Shigaraki or Kurogiri to be in Hosu, much less in person. He'd seen the multitude of monsters tearing into the city and assumed that the most childish man alive wouldn't be there to witness the destruction himself. It hadn't even crossed his mind, and he'd almost paid the price. You really think that low-level weapon of yours is going to stop me from taking what I want? He knew he only had the hero killer to thank, but that thought alone made his stomach bile curdle. What happened after? The change in subject was painful, overpowering the dull aches in his side. Thankfully, neither Ida nor Todoroki made mention of it. Midori, with Kami's help, scooted just enough to give Todoroki room to sit on the edge of his bed rather than stand. He made no comment, but did sit gracefully, keeping his hand pressed comfortably on Midoriya's back, running up and down in delicate, almost fearful touches. It really wasn't much. He started hesitantly. You passed out right after the hero killer did. The pros secured him for good, the ambulance arrived, and we've been here since. One of the pros stopped by earlier, but only for a short moment. Ida added, now sitting at the foot of his bed, which was across from them, just to try and get closer to the radiating emotional support. Apparently, what knocked the hero killer out was a broken rib piercing his lung. He's expected to survive surgery, however. Midori shuddered, causing Todoroki to pull him closer to the warmth of his left side in response, but it wasn't the thought of the hero killer surviving that had his blood rush with anxiety. "Midoriya, dear, you would have died." He knew how that kind of pain felt, and the hissing of his lung like a popped balloon wasn't a fate that he'd wished on anyone. Really, the pain of death was not a punishment that usually crossed his mind, and the few times it ever did, he was left sickened at his own thoughts. He looked back up at his friends. Todoroki had thick bandages wrapped around the arm that had been impaled with knives, with only small dots of red as proof of the heavy bleeding from before. Both of Ida's arms were in slings, one from the stab wound the hero killer had initially used to paralyze him, and the other from the blades that he'd intentionally thrown himself in front of to protect Todoroki. And yet they sat so alert, so concerned for his well-being, when it should have been the other way around. He was the one that was supposed to save Ida. He was the one who'd unintentionally brought Todoroki into the fray, yet here he was, being coddled because he'd walked away the most injured again. And despite the guilt that flooded him, he selfishly clung onto the ending that he'd seen in his head, and how the present he was graced with currently was not the same. He really was lucky, unfairly so. "That's odd." Todoroki drastically changed the subject again, pointing upward toward the ceiling. The light stopped flickering. Confused, Midori looked up, only for his eyes to shy away from the brightness. "What?" "The lights were flickering the entire time that we've been in here, but it seems as if they've stopped," Ida filled in. "Maintenance must have fixed whatever the electrical issue was." Todoroki shrugged dismissively. "I guess." There was a quiet knock at the door to their room, instantly making Todoroki shoot up from his spot on Midoriya's bed and return to his own. The door slid open a moment after, allowing Gran Torino, Manuel, and a man with a dog head that Midoriya had never seen before walk in. "Good to see you all up and awake," Gran Torino chirped, but it lacked his usual amount of sarcastic life, instead remaining seriously dull. The elder strutted right up to the side of Midoriya's cot, looking the boy over. "I want to grumble my heart out, but just glad to see you all right." Midoriya wasn't sure if he was all right, clutching self-consciously at his injured sides, but he nodded anyway, the words getting caught in his throat. "More importantly, now that you're all up, you have a visitor." Manuel gestured to the unknown man standing just behind him, clearing the way for him. "The chief of Hosu Police Precinct, Suragame Kenji." Immediately all the children had stood from their beds in polite manners that had been drilled into them all since they were young. Todoroki and Ida had little trouble doing so, but Midoriya, in the truest of fashions, forgot at the moment that his leg was still gravely wounded, and nearly dropped to his feet in shock. Thankfully, Todoroki was more than ready to catch him, holding him up in his arms. The police chief instantly waved his hands. "Don't worry, you can remain seated. I know you've all had it quite rough." Todoroki helped Midoriya back onto his bed, refusing to allow him even a peep of argument that he could still stand, and Midoriya did not argue, in fact, allowing the weight of his body to be taken off of his weaker leg. He audibly sighed in relief upon sitting again, letting himself truly relax for the first time in 3 days. No one had died tonight. "So, you're the ones who put a stop to the hero killer." The chief chuckled lightly. "You're UA kids, all right." And yet somehow that thought was not as comforting as it should have been, as Suragame's expression had soured into something more serious, his muzzle dropping almost like a frown. That was enough to spark Ida's memory about their previous conversation, thankfully. "Wait, please. Before you begin, Midori informed us upon his wake that Shigaraki was present in the vicinity." Suragame didn't look surprised. In fact, none of the pros did, catching the group of teens off guard. "Ah, yes. The hero killer adamantly insisted that he tell us of the League of Villains' presence and interest in your classmate, despite the risk of aggravating his injuries and his injured lung." The man turned to Midoriya with almost gentleness in his eyes. "I will have to take your statement on the matter later, but for now, glad to see you well and with us." Midoriya held his head in his free hand in confusion, first saving and defending him from Shigaraki despite his opportunity to escape, now risking the worsening of his own injuries to inform police about the matter. He knew the villain considered him to be a true hero, but was he really worth all this effort? They were on opposing sides. He'd passively witnessed 17 of the hero killer's murders without being able to do anything about them, and yet it made him sick to admit that he was genuinely confused about this man. He didn't understand. Everything was so much easier when he was looking in black and white, but now that he was forcing himself through gray, everything just hurt. "Actually, regarding the hero killer, he sustained some pretty serious injuries, several burns, bone fractures, a collapsed lung." The chief continued on his previous train of thought. "He is currently undergoing treatment for them, but is expected to make a full recovery." Midori could feel Todoroki's conflicting emotions through the drastic fluctuation in temperature behind him, and in an effort to comfort him like he'd done for Midoriya earlier, He drifted a hand back along the bed. Slowly, Midoriya could feel the sheets move as Todoroki's hand slid next to his, their fingers almost touching, a wash of emotional relief capturing them both. Since you're all UA students, I'm sure you already know that when superpowers were still becoming the norm, the police attached high importance to leadership and standards. They made sure that quirks were not used as weapons. Too focused on the chief's words, Midoriya failed to notice how Gami's posture shifted, growing defensive. Dropping the room's temperature by another few degrees, Midoriya had merely assumed it was Todoroki again and moved his hand closer. Soragami took a small step forward, that action alone non-hostile, but amongst the tension of barely surviving a battle to the death, all the children tensed unconsciously. Eventually, the profession of hero would emerge to fill that gap, but for an individual using force and power that could easily kill others to be accepted officially, that was all thanks to early heroes who followed the ethics and rules of this profession. Midoriya's breath got caught in his throat. Owari, I'm giving you full permission to use your quirk to defend and protect. His muscles had twitched in realization. Todoroki mistook it for nervousness and moved his hand to rest on top of his. That did nothing to stop the bile from clawing up his throat. Even up against the hero killer, for uncertified individuals to cause injury with their quirks without specific instructions from their guardians or supervisors is a clear violation of the rules. Todoroki's hand squeezed his out of shock. Now, I was made aware that one of you did have explicit permission to use your quirk tonight, and by that, the chief turned to Midoriya again. Gran Torino understood that he would legally take the fall for any public backlash because of your actions. Soragami looked back at all three of them again. But as for the two of you, and the pro-heroes manual and endeavor, that understanding was never established, therefore you must receive strict punishment. Midoriya's posture snapped up, but the words came more hesitantly. That wasn't fair. It was his fault Todoroki was there in the first place, and if Ida had truly sought out the hero killer solely fueled on the hate that came from his supposed curse, then that was his fault too. But wait! But Todoroki's anger had beat him to the punch. If Ida hadn't done anything, then Native would have been killed, and if Izuku hadn't come, then both of them would have died. Ida looked over at his friend, shame plastered all over his face. Todoroki. No one realized that the hero killer had appeared. Midoriya had. He'd known all along, and he hadn't told anyone. He'd sunk into his skin in shame, retreating behind his oversized hospital gown and layers of bandages. But how was he supposed to? He was only trying to keep his secret safe. He was trying to keep himself safe from prying and backlash and possibly even losing his only shot at a dream. But at the possible expense of Ida's life, and now his friends' careers? How selfish. Are you saying that we should have just followed the rules and watched people get killed? Todoroki took a clearly hostile step forward, and that finally prompted Midoriya to step in before the situation could possibly get any worse. He turned around, ignoring how his body had begged him to stop, and held a hand out in front of his friend, squeezing his other hand back, if only to remind him that they were safe. No one had died tonight. Why didn't that make him feel any better? Wait. Are you saying that as long as it turns out all right, it's okay to bend the rules? All three of them flinched at the calm, unwavering tone of the chief, and yet then practically flinched a second time at his steely stare. Todoroki did not advance any further, remaining right next to Midoriya, but his head still snapped up like a rabid dog on a chain. Isn't it a hero's job to save people? But Surigame merely lowered his head with closed eyes. That's why you aren't full-fledged heroes yet. Goodness, what has UA and Endeavor been teaching you? That was enough. Todoroki ripped his hand from Midoriya's, pushing past without care as he moved to confront the man. Both Ida and Midoriya cried out, trying to calm their friend, but with Ida's slinged arms and Midoriya's weak leg, neither could move to hold Todoroki back. Thankfully, Gran Torino stepped forward, holding his hand in the teen's way. Hang on a minute. Hear him out to the end. Todoroki scoffed loudly, but stopped in his path, taking a step back to stand at the foot of Midoriya's bed. Midoriya scooted a little closer to the end, if only to remind him that he was there. The chief dropped his shoulders in what looked like relief. Whether that was real in any amount, Midoriya couldn't tell. That was the official opinion of the police, and the punishments would only happen if this was all made public. He rubbed at his nose, still an eerily calm look plastered across his muzzle. If this were made public, you all would probably be endlessly applauded, but then you would not be able to escape punishment. The three of them shared a look. None of them could be certain of what it was. On the other hand, and this is a bit underhanded, if this was not made public, then the burn scars would support Endeavor being the hero who stopped the hero killer. There weren't many witnesses, so this violation could end here, but that would also mean that no one would know of your achievements tonight. Todoroki's eyes narrowed, and his body visibly tensed. Of course, there's a third option. Because Midoriya was the only one to properly get permission to use his quirk, he could take full credit for stopping the hero killer. Surigame had proposed with a shrug. But that would also mean that he would take full public backlash for the brutal injuries. Gran Torino would take responsibility for his actions and anything that he might have done that could be considered against the law, but that would not stop the public from potentially turning against him, especially with his easily villainized quirk, plus that would still not explain away the burn scars. Both Ida and Todoroki instinctively turned to Midoriya, and he couldn't stop the natural cowardice in him. He shied away, unable to bring his eyes up to meet them. He didn't like how much fear that option put into his heart. He didn't like how afraid he was of his own power, to the point where even he couldn't trust its ability to do good. But he also didn't like the way Todoroki shifted at the option before. He didn't like how he could feel the temperature drop around him. If the chief noticed the tension between the teens, he didn't care. So which do you prefer? Personally, I don't want it to be the one to find fault in you promising young heroes because of one mistake. For a moment, none of them said a word, but Midoriya was tired of letting his hesitation shut him up. I don't mind taking the blame for this, he stumbled out. I know it wouldn't be fair to you guys, but... Todoroki turned to face him sharply. Why are you forcing yourself? It's obvious you aren't comfortable with that option. I saw how you reacted when it was brought up. And I saw how you reacted if Endeavor was going to take the credit. Midoriya looked at him sternly, the first time since his gaze had finally hardened from the soft vulnerability that it was upon waking. It was my fault that you were even caught up in this in the first place. It's the least I can do. No. Ida interrupted them both. It was my fault. You both were caught up in my mess, but if I were to choose an option of punishing myself, I'd say let me be punished and the public know the truth, and that's not fair to either of you. Todoroki nodded in agreement. I'm glad I got your message. I'm glad I was there and that I could help instead of finding out when you both didn't return to class. I think I speak for Ida as well when I say that we're in this together. We either all get punished together or we don't. You're not going to be the scapegoat alone. Midoriya tried to swallow his tears. He desperately needed a good cry, but not in front of two pro-heroes and the chief of Hosu police. Still, he couldn't stop the trickles of salt from escaping in the corners of his eyes. He hunched in on himself to try and hide his shame, and Todoroki quickly pulled him into a half-armed hug to block the sight from view. If anyone noticed, which was nearly impossible not to, no one said a word. No one had died tonight. He needed to start small. Ida rose from his bed, capturing everyone's attention. Even Midoriya's head rose from its sheltered place, eyes nothing more than reddened and dotted with splotchy stains. He stopped before Manuel and Surigame, and then lowered himself into a deep bow, even with both arms in splints. I am truly sorry. Manuel leaned forward slightly, hitting him lightly on the crown of his bowed head. I'm sure you know the trouble you've caused. If you understand, then don't do it again. Midoriya had shifted uncomfortably. Racked with a familiar level of guilt that he never grew accustomed to, he broke away from Todoroki, shuffling to the edge of his bed, where he could bow his head, his hair masking the overwhelming wrong that shone from his eyes. I'm sorry as well. There were other, better decisions I could have made beforehand, but I put people in danger instead. A hand rested on Midoriya's shoulder, and at first he thought it was Todoroki's, but the cold, undead chill gave it away. My instincts caused me to hesitate, and instead I chose to be selfish when I could have done more, and for that, I am sorry. Midoriya nearly swiveled his head back, but the raw sincerity in Kami's voice stopped him, long before he even remembered that there were others around him. Todoroki was the last to bow. I apologize. Please take care of it. Neither Ida nor Midoriya argued with the choice. The chief had nodded. Because of the unfairness of adults, you will not be able to receive the collective praise that you would have probably gotten, but at least... Surigame then gave a deep bow in return. As someone who also protects the peace, I thank you. Midoriya shrank bashfully and undeservingly, catching Todoroki also shy away out of embarrassment. Ida moved to look at them, and the three smiled softly together, completely missing the exit of the pro-heroes and the chief of Hosu police, leaving the children to catch up on whatever rest they possibly could after such a stressful night, but no one wanted to sleep anyway. And why would they sleep when, instead, they could hug and laugh and cry and remind each other that, by some ungodly miracle, they'd all made it out alive and together. No one had died tonight, and for tonight, that was enough. When they eventually passed out from exhaustion, Kami made sure that all three were comfortably tucked in before standing guard in front of the room door. The next morning, both Ida and Todoroki were promptly whisked away into surgery before Midoriya even had a chance to wake and see them off. Upon his eventual wake, he was bombarded with nurses at his bedside, checking his vitals and all. Apparently he'd healed much faster than they'd anticipated overnight. His major life-threatening injuries had settled away from fatality almost completely. His condition was so much of an improvement, he no longer needed the surgery planned for him that morning. Midori laughed it off. What a miracle. Nothing supernatural to see here. Still, that left him by himself for the next few hours while his friends' injuries were being treated. Unfortunately, none of the nurses would allow him to leave the room for some fresh air, so he had to settle for waiting for the hospital staff to finally leave him alone before getting some space to breathe. Finally, when the last nurse had assured him that there would be no more medical visits until his friends had returned and promptly left the room, Midori audibly exhaled before turning to his mentor directly for the first time in nearly half a day. "Hey, Gami." The ghost had turned to him, floating up to his bedside. "I wanted to talk to you." "I am so sorry. I know I should have listened to you last night and properly searched for Ida." "Stop." Midori held out his hand. Gami did. He then sighed, bringing it back down. "Look, I wish you had actually split up to search instead of staying close to me, but if you had, you might not have been back in time to save Ida and Todoroki's lives like you did. I can't be angry at you, because you were right beside me when I needed you." He looked down into his lap, unable to look Gami's general direction anymore. "Really, I was angry because I was thinking about the worst possible thing that could have happened when everything had already worked itself out in the best way that I could have asked, and I took it out on you. For that, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve any of that." Gami softened, placing both of his hands on the sides of Midori's face, pulling his eyes up to look at him. "I appreciate your apology, but I still feel partially to blame for purposely ignoring what you asked of me. Can we instead agree to forgive each other?" Midori smiled, placing his hands atop of Gami's cold ones. "Of course." He was really happy to have a partner like him. "I'm glad we worked that out." He pulled Gami's hands down, but still held them in his own. "But that actually wasn't what I wanted to talk to you about." The ghost cocked his head, waiting patiently for his successor to continue. "I've been noticing over the past few days, but I wasn't sure enough to bring up anything. Yesterday sealed the deal for me." I am afraid I do not understand." "You've been writing in my notebook for me while I practice, bringing me groceries while I shop. You're even pushing my chair in for me after dinner." Midori shrugged to himself. "I thought it was odd at first. Those were all so minor, I didn't think much of it. But yesterday, you pulled the hero killer's scarf so hard that you made him stumble. You knocked one of his swords right out into the sky, and the Nomu had grabbed me. You screamed so loudly that every street lamp on that street had shattered." Gami looked a little nervous at that point. I suppose I did." "I thought it was a little strange that you were so insistent on being near me at all times, and then last night, Todoroki mentioned how the room lights were flickering until after I woke up." "I do not mean to be rude by interrupting, but what exactly are you getting at here?" Midori looked at him pointedly, but gave in. "You're acting a lot like a poltergeist, Gami." His mentor had no outward reaction, merely floating in silence for an awkward moment of time. "I'm afraid you must enlighten me. What is a poltergeist?" Right," Midori mumbled under his breath. "You don't know what that is." The teen shifted to the edge of the bed, causing Gami to scoot back to give him room to dangle his legs off the side. "Poltergeists, they're like a certain type of ghost." He started slowly. "They're pretty powerful. They're known for being able to interact with physical objects pretty easily, as well as messing with lights." "Ah, I see how you can make the correlation then." Midori continued. "The thing about poltergeists is that they're very emotional kinds of ghosts. Usually they form an attachment to something important, and just being around that attachment makes them stronger, but they can get really hostile if that attachment is threatened." The pieces finally clicked. "You think my sudden inability to separate myself from you is an attachment?" "Everything else fits," Midori nodded. "But why now? Wouldn't I have had this attachment to you earlier in years, when we've been together? I've only found myself unable to leave your side as of recently." Midori tapped his chin thoughtfully. "I'm not sure. Poltergeists also tend to be really emotional compared to other ghosts, and you haven't really been like that until recently, too." The teen looked up sharply at his mentor all of a sudden. "Have you remembered anything new or important lately? New memories would definitely be an emotional spark." "I have not." Gami lied like the liar he was. "How exactly do you know all of this about poltergeists? It is not something that I have taught you as death." The teen almost didn't notice the sudden shift in topic. "Well, I didn't start noticing until recently, but a lot of the souls I sort of happen to share. Trends, I guess? I don't know. It was just these little things that were totally unrelated. Their souls, they had it in common. Some souls can stay bright regardless of time after death or intensity. Some souls can share their memories like premonitions. Some souls can project emotions onto me, but no soul has ever made more than one of these trends, so I got curious." Midori suddenly looked away, his cheeks rosy with light embarrassment. Looking back on it now, it sounds kind of silly, but I tried to see what I could find online. I thought maybe there was someone with a quirk that was something like my powers, maybe someone who knew a little more about, well, you know. He scratched his neck sheepishly. Of course, there wasn't. A discovery like that would have made it to the news, but science fiction was surprisingly accurate to what I noticed. That or just really generalizing. So you are beginning to classify souls. And I fit this poltergeist kind? I mean, I guess. I'm not really trying to classify anyone. I just got curious, he admitted. But yeah, you do fit a poltergeist really well. Though, to be fair, there could be a lot of other kinds of souls. The only ones I feel confident in saying I know are poltergeist and Yurei. Gami didn't even bother asking about the other one. I suppose the title is fine. I do not personally mind it. Midori looked a little relieved. Just let me know if you noticed anything else new. Like I said, poltergeists are known for being pretty strong, and considering how long we've known each other, your strength is growing fast all of a sudden. I don't want anything to catch us off guard. I will. I promise. The door to the hospital room suddenly opened, and a nurse wheeled in Todoroki. Shoto! Midori scrambled to the edge of the bed, trying to follow his friend as he was moved through the room. Why was he in a wheelchair? As far as he knew, he was the only one who had injured his legs in last night's fight. Did something go wrong in his surgery? Are you all right? Did something happen to your legs? Don't worry, Izuku. I'm all right. The nurse merely insisted that I be wheeled back to the room after surgery. Todoroki pushed himself up onto his bed as the nurse took the wheelchair and left. My surgery was deemed successful, and my arm should be healed with no complications. Midori almost crumpled in relief, relaxing back into his pillows. Oh, thank goodness. That's so good to hear. The two mellowed into silence. Midori was a little annoyed that he couldn't finish his conversation with Gami, but that was balanced out by the utter relief that at least Todoroki was going to be all right. The weeks of non-stop hero-killer premonitions had taken a lot out of him, and when they culminated into the hell that was last night, the teen had no energy left to resist becoming a pathetic, reliant mess. He knew he needed it. He had still yet to have a good cry, he promised himself once this fiasco was over, but he couldn't help but feel pitiful anyway. Izuku, Todoroki started out of the blue. Can I ask you something? Midori perked up, intrigued and a little nervous. Yeah, sure. Todoroki looked to the side, almost in shame, almost debating on something. You were mentioning that name, Gami, again in your sleep. The other had moved to interrupt, but was promptly silenced by Todoroki's raised hand. If you don't want to talk about it, I completely understand, but I'd rather you just tell me that up front than pretend as if you don't know what I'm talking about. He looked at Midori expectantly, a neutral tone overtaking his features. Midori shuffled uncomfortably in extreme internal struggle to avoid looking back at his mentor for guidance. He trusted Todoroki, and he didn't want this to be a reason that his friend lost trust in him. But at the same time, this was Gami, his most closely guarded secret. It already kept him up at night thinking about how many people knew of the ghost's existence, whether they truly believed it or not. Plus, this was really Gami's decision. It shouldn't be up to Midoriya, who knew of his existence and who didn't, but Todoroki obviously didn't believe the first lie, and he figured doubling down might be just as unconvincing and damaging to their friendship as the first. Damn it! Why did Todoroki have to be so observant? Midori felt a soft, cold touch on his shoulder, reminding him that Gami was still by his side. That Gami would always be by his side, and he suddenly knew exactly what to say. Gami is a good friend. He's always made me feel safe. Oh, I see. Todoroki scratched at his hospital gown. Do you get to see each other often? Midori smiled softly, a mix of genuinity and solemnness. Yeah, but we don't get to talk as much as I'd like. Todoroki frowned, looking off to the side. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I told you because I trust you, Shoto. And he did. Maybe, the other began quietly, you could introduce us one day. Midori blinked owlishly, at a momentary loss for words. His eyes instinctively glanced to the side, settling on his mentor for just a second. Then he remembered they weren't alone, so his gaze returned to how it should. Maybe one day. He laughed just as softly as his smile. He'd love to meet you. And he would. The door slid open once more, again interrupting Midoriya. The trend was starting to become annoying, but again that feeling was quickly dashed as Ida was promptly wheeled in by a nurse. Ida! Midori exclaimed. Todoroki followed up with a sigh of relief. How did your surgery go? Their friend eyed the room nervously, not a good sign. He waited until the nurse left the room before slouching into himself atop his hospital bed. It seems my left hand will have residual complications. Midori's heart stopped. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Both of my arms were heavily damaged, but it appears the damage is particularly severe in my left arm. He glanced down solemnly at the arm in question. They told me that my brachial plexus is impaired. Suddenly and uncontrollably, a harsh shiver ran down Midoriya's spine as the taste of blood entered his mouth, seeping down his throat into his lungs over his eyes, and yet it was more metallic guilt than anything else. Still, that didn't exactly make him feel any better. He wasn't fast enough. Actually, all it amounts to is being hard to move my fingers, and a little numbness. Ida tried and mostly failed at moving his hand as an example. There's even a chance that it could heal through nerve grafting surgery. Those blasts you've been using, they're causing you extreme nerve damage. No. I'll be able to heal the rest later, but there's a possibility your hands will never truly regain their full mobility. Was everything in his life some sort of sick joke? Midori clenched his own hands unforgivingly tight. It was almost as if every accomplishment that he was making came back to wound him like a forgotten boomerang. This couldn't be purposeful. Despite how closely it seemed to strike him, despite how personal of a defeat this was, when it wasn't even his to begin with, surely the universe didn't care about him this much. Surely the universe wasn't this spiteful. Right? When I found the hero killer, I became incapable of rational thought. I should have contacted Manuel first. Ida lowered his head in shame, the nervousness in his eyes replaced by a guilt that Midori was all too familiar with. I hate that bastard, but what he said was the truth. Todoroki took to defend Ida of his own self-hate. Hey, but Ida merely shook his head before he could speak. That's why, until I can rectify my actions, until I can say that I've changed from the person I was last night, I think I'll leave my left hand like this. Midori's instinct was to spout the blame that he'd been swallowing for years. His instinct was to burst right then and there, to take fault for everything, because it was his fault. Ida's hate, putting his friend in danger at the first place, and it was all too close to the budding theory he had about himself to actually be denied any longer. This was all his fault, and it sickened him to know that now Ida was suffering from the same injury that he had cheated past, all because he was his friend. He had no real evidence to say that this was more than just the sick series of coincidences that presented in his life, but this unnatural hate, Kiori's hate that killed Ishihara, Bakugo's hate that nearly killed Uraraka and Ida, Todoroki's hate that almost made him kill on national television, Ida's hate that nearly got him killed. He refused to try and pretend that it had nothing to do with him, because it had everything to do with him. The right thing to do was to stop trying to love. The right thing to do was to confess everything to Todoroki and Ida and let them leave him. But he was selfish, and after tasting what friendship and affection could become, he would always be. So instead, he swallowed everything just as he had been, bottling before. Ida. He looked down at his own hands, and then quickly pulled them behind his back, ashamed to look at his perfectly still hands any further. You really are amazing. His friend moved to argue, clearly disagreeing, but Midori didn't let him. You put yourself in so much danger, while I was stuck immobile on the sidelines. Midori dug his nails into his skin. I never want to be stuck like that again. He pushed himself off his hospital bed, wincing lightly at the pain in his leg, but it was more than manageable now compared to last night, and he shuffled over to Ida's bedside, stopping right before him. Would you be offended if I promised alongside you, if we swore to be stronger, to be better together? Ida looked up at him, and for almost a second a soft smile had graced his face, one that Midori had sorely missed. Of course not. You're my friend, Midori, and I swear to you that I won't allow anything to change that ever again. Midori couldn't help himself from bursting into tears, nearly collapsing to his knees at those very words alone. His friends had rushed to help him, but he held out a shaking hand, stopping them from moving forward. Using that same hand, he messily wiped the tears off his cheeks, but he couldn't stop the pitiful wetness that came from his throat. I'm sorry, I didn't realize how much I hurt you. No, you don't have to apologize, Ida. Midori couldn't stop himself from interrupting. He didn't want Ida to feel bad. This was all his fault. Ida's hate had to be his fault. He just couldn't stop himself from being pathetically selfish, so he could still have Ida's friendship anyway. I'm just so lucky to have you as a friend. He didn't notice how Gami painfully reeled from that word. As am I. Ida had slid off his bed, and even though he couldn't use his hands, he still joined Midori in some makeshift mosh pit. In fact, I'm sure all of us feel the same way towards you, Midori. Even Todoroki, after some awkward hesitation, had joined them both on the floor. You've always been there for us, even when we've hurt you, so we'll always be there for you, not because it is fair, but because we care the same way. You are a friend. You are my friend, and I refuse to have my judgment clouded ever again. Midoriya sobbed harder, his friends embraced him harder, and finally the stains left by the hero killer were washed away with salty tears and selfish relief. No one had died last night. It was all finally over. Gran Torino was quick to get Midori out of the hospital, since today was technically the last day of the internship. Not that the hero didn't want him around, but he really only had the rest of the day to pack according to his train departing tomorrow morning. He wasn't totally brand new yet. He was given a single crutch to help him walk and keep some of the weight off of his injured leg. Midori figured that he couldn't be in that bad a shape, not if the hospital staff actually let Gran Torino check him out. But the way he winced if he accidentally stepped down too roughly said otherwise. Honestly, that didn't bother him as much as it should have. He was much more relieved by the fact that there would be no lasting damage in his chest. Turned out his ribs were only fractured, not broken like what had happened at the USJ. They'll heal on their own, no complications, no side effects, no scars. The last part relieved him more than he'd like to admit. Only his leg would scar, and none of the injuries given to him by the Nomu would. He wasn't really sure how he'd take it if he had another mark left on him because of Shigaraki. Ida and Todoroki were still stuck in the hospital, but they'd assured that they'd be back in time for classes next week. He almost wanted to stay with them both because he wasn't sure his heart would be ready to be separated again, but that morning train waited for no one. Still, it wasn't like he didn't have their numbers or anything. They'd made a group chat, the three of them, just before Gran Torino checked him out. Midori knew it was under the guise of him being a worrywart, but he had a strong feeling that they all needed to be somewhat connected for a while as they had healed. After all, no matter how many times things came so close to disaster, Midori knew that he'd never get used to it. The rest of the day, Gran Torino was surprisingly attentive with him. Not that he didn't appreciate the concern, it was just a little strange after it being so difficult to coax the hero into taking an active stance with his training. Gran Torino insisted on him staying on the couch most of the time, as to not aggravate his healing wounds. While he instead had fixed his things in preparation for his departure, he packed away his hero costume, which was torn, folded most of his clothes, even washed everything for him. Honestly, Midori couldn't remember the last time someone had done his laundry for him. As it had gotten farther into the evening, Midori had prepared to make dinner, but Gran Torino hadn't allowed that either. He'd forced him to remain on the couch, as he stepped into his room for a while. About an hour later, someone knocked on the door with takeout, and the elder handed the delivery man a lot more cash than takeout would ever cost. The teen felt a little guilty at that, but that was quickly washed away by the savory taste of yakitori hitting the pit in his stomach. It didn't take much longer after that to finalize the last of his things in preparation for tomorrow, and it wasn't long after that Midori gave up on trying to stay up. There was a lot he still had to do, at least when it came to his other job, but Gami convinced him to take it easy for the night, and Gami was always right, so Midori did just that, carefully changing into pajamas and getting settled for his first early night since coming to intern with Gran Torino. It was when he was about to get ready and try to sleep, a healthy 8 hours for the first time in a while, when his phone buzzed. "Just leave it," Gami pleaded. "Whatever it is, it can wait." But Midori shook his head. "It could be important. Besides, it won't take me that long." The ghost sighed exasperatedly, but still followed his successor as he reached for his phone, peering over his shoulder as the notification popped up on the screen. "I don't mean to bother you, but are you awake and free by any chance?" "It's from Ida," Midori mumbled, even though he knew Gami could read perfectly well from over his shoulder. The teen expected to hear another groan from behind him, mostly at the fact that this would no longer take him not that long, but to his surprise, what greeted him was the opposite, silence. Midori looked back down at his screen and made his decision. "Yeah, I'm free. What's up?" It didn't take long for his phone to ping again. "Can I call you?" Again he looked at his mentor to judge his opinion, but Gami merely shrugged, not in any way that was dismissive or sarcastic, but in a solely indifferent way that the ghost rarely expressed. So Midoriya sat down on the makeshift cushion bed, and the one that Gran Torino insisted he have for his last night, and he made his decision. It was always his decision. "Sure." His phone rang not long after. "Hey, Ida." He pressed the phone to his ear. "Well, what's up? Is Shoto with you?" The other end crackled with life. "No, I'm alone in the lobby. Todoroki's upstairs in his room. We both should be good to check out by tomorrow." A laugh followed. "It's funny, I didn't realize how close you and Todoroki are. I didn't know that you were calling each other by your given names already." It's not like that," Midori stuttered, face reddening with embarrassment. "It's just a nickname. It's what he feels comfortable with, and I wanted to respect that." Ida's laughing had settled down. "I'm just poking fun at you. Sorry if I made you uncomfortable." It's fine." Midori slapped at his cheeks, trying to dull away the rosiness. Was there something that you wanted to talk about?" The other end grew quiet, and Midori couldn't help but shuffle in nervousness. He hoped nothing was wrong, just the thought had kick-started his blood again, like he was caught up once more with the sheer fear of that alley. What you said in the alley about wanting revenge, was that true? Midori relieved considerably, but a new wave of unease had washed over him, one so cold he'd almost forgotten about it. Fingers! He's shooting fingers at us! Yeah, he admitted. Yeah, it was. A long silence stretched between them, far beyond the miles and miles truly between them, but Midori wouldn't have minded if it all just ended there. But he knew Ida was waiting. Ida was waiting for what he needed to hear. I knew a great man growing up. He was my first real friend. Midori smiled at the thought, remembering the cookies, the tea, the chess games, the gentleness of casual care. He was killed during a villain's getaway a few months ago. Oh. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. Midori shook his head, not like Ida could see. I was haunted by the fact that I couldn't save him, but even more so I was haunted by the man who killed him, and I refused to talk to anyone about it because I was too afraid to acknowledge what I was feeling. I need to know if you have a villain with a finger rocket quirk in your custody. Instead, I let my feelings consume me, and in turn I almost did something that I would have regretted for the rest of my life. Forever, really. I recognized someone. A quirk, I mean. I really didn't mean to, Ida suddenly spoke up again, from the end of the line. How did you stop? Revenge is not an easy choice to pass up. I underestimated your strength. Midori knew exactly what he meant. I met his brother, and I finally got the full picture. It really was an accident, but what really hit me was just how much his life had been affected too. Look, kid, I know I screwed up. I don't need you to tell me more than I have to hear it. It was a bad decision, but I can't take it back now, can I? He wasn't a good man, but he wasn't a bad man. He was a person who made some bad decisions, hurt people around him, and paid the price for it. Midori sighed, taking in a shaky breath. I'd spent so long hating him, and then his brother. I spent so long vilifying them in my head that I didn't know what to do when I realized just how human they were. I know I fucked up, kid, and I can't go back in time, so just leave it be. Did you forgive them? Ida asked, small and lost like a young child. Because I don't think I can forgive the hero killer. I'm so sorry. I know that means nothing, but I'm apologizing for the both of us. No, I didn't forgive either of them. I don't think I ever could, Midori admitted. When I found out that someone had killed a good man like Ishihara, I was convinced there could only be good people and bad people in this world. And all the hate I was refusing to acknowledge, I ended up taking it out on other people that didn't deserve it. The teen dug his nails into his skin at the thought of the countless lives that he unfairly judged, rarely reading into them as people because of the hate that clouded his vision. When I talked to him, I was forced to acknowledge that people were complex. Everything wasn't black and white, as I was trying to make it, and it broke me. I wasn't all right that day. I wasn't all right for a long time after. I could never forgive them, but regardless of if I did or not, none of that was what Ishihara would have wanted. Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro. All he wanted was for me to follow my dreams and be happy, and me holding on to all that hate in his name, it wasn't helping any of that, so I let it go. I didn't forgive them. I could never forget them. I just moved forward. But how? The wetness in Ida's voice practically soaked through the speaker. I can't. He hurt my brother. He can't. He'll never be a hero again. Midori tried to wipe the tears from his eyes, but they still escaped him anyway. It doesn't happen in a day, and it's hard. I still get angry and sad, and I'll always miss him. But I promise to change for him. I promise to protect the people like him, the people who can't protect themselves. I promise to fight for the happy ending that he never got to have. Midori held the phone away from his face for a moment, trying to quiet his sniffles. I want people to know that I'll fight forever for that happy ending if I have to. I'm sure that Ingenium feels the same way, Midori whispered, almost afraid of acknowledgement, despite having gotten this far. He loves you, Ida. All he wants is for you to be happy, and you hating the hero killer, wanting revenge all in his name, it's tearing you apart, and I doubt that's what he wants at all. Tensei, Ida sobbed, and Midori couldn't tell if the brokenness was a fault of the phone's poor audio quality or the sheer agony of breaking Ida's heart. I love him so much, I I just want him to be okay." "He is okay." He looked up at Gami, who had moved over to be near him. "Because he's got you, Ida. And you've got him. What you're feeling right now, what you've been feeling since he got hurt, you're just bottling it up. Talk to him. Talk to someone. Him, me, Shoto or Araka, hell, even Aizawa-sensei. All we want is for you to be okay. We all care about you. We don't ever want you to bottle up what you're feeling and struggle alone. That's what we're here for, to be your friends." A long silence stretched between them. A silence of shared sorrow, of paralleled pain. A silence filled with the same sound of tears and all the same feeling. A loud relief of silence. A quiet understanding of silence, and all the silence in between, the miles and miles between them. You're a great friend, Midori. I don't know what I'd do without you." Midori laughed solemnly in response, a wet, broken laugh like he was so used to, and yet with the unfamiliar absence of the ache that always accompanied it. "Same here." And the silence between them was broken. Midori didn't get nearly as much sleep as he should have last night, but Gran Torino didn't need to know that. As for Gami, who bore witness to it all, well, he expected a lecture on the train home, but he had a feeling the ghost understood this time. He'd get off easy. There wasn't much time to do anything other than finish packing the last of his clothes and get ready to leave, which wasn't exactly as easy as it sounded considering he was still crutch-bound. Gami helped him with most of it, but until he was finally out of Gran Torino's sight, he was still with his backpack, briefcase in one hand, and crutch in the other. Midoriya trudged down the stairs for the final time, preparing to leave without much of a goodbye, when he had peered into the main space and nearly slipped off the last step. Gran Torino sat patiently at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea that Midoriya had bought from the grocery store the other day. Upon noticing him, the elder had stood up, slowly walked over to him with his cane. "Well, good morning to you, too." Good morning," Midoriya chuckled awkwardly. "I wasn't expecting you to be awake." Gran Torino rolled his eyes. "You'd be right most of the time, but what kind of teacher would I be if I didn't see you out?" He huffed in mock sarcasm. "Kids these days." The hero strolled over to the front door and propped it open with a violent kick much too deceiving for his old age. He held it open as Midori smiled thankfully, shuffling through onto the front stoop with slow, careful steps. Gami floated behind just in case, but there wasn't much he could do with Gran Torino's watchful eyes. Upon making it down the stairs, the teen set the briefcase down with a breath of relief as Gran Torino stepped out as well. "Thank you so much for mentoring me this past week." Midori gave another soft smile as he thought about jumping from roof to roof, about patrolling with only the stars to witness, about the wind fluttering through his hair. "I'm really happy with the skills I'm walking away with." Gran Torino sighed. "I feel like I barely mentored you at all, especially with how all this ended up." Midori had laughed sheepishly. "Well, all the times we sparred really helped me to move around the hero killer long enough for backup to arrive." When only silence had answered him, the teen looked up, nervously worried that he soured the mood. A sour look on Gran Torino's face did greet him, which sparked something of a sour taste in Midori's mouth. Still, I don't know what I was thinking for those first few days. I guess I was trying to teach you like I did Toshinori." Gran Torino looked up at him, serious expression from that Hosu knight plastered on his old face again. "When I should have been teaching you like Midoriya." Midori didn't know what to say. What could he say to that? He opened his mouth and closed it, dumbfoundedly, gaping like a fish out of water. Gran Torino noticed his perplexed look and shook his head in response. "You don't have to say anything. This one's on me. But I'd only be making it worse if I didn't admit that before you left." He paused for a moment, much like Midoriya did, when trying to gather the thoughts scattered in his head, when trying to pick the words that meant exactly what he meant. His face then shifted into something like a smirk, but softer, something like the expression he knew Gami liked to make, despite never having seen it before. "I'm glad you came to intern with me. I haven't really done any of this hero stuff since Toshinori. And I'm sure this isn't the last internship that you'll be getting through UA." The elder had reached into his back pocket, that Midori didn't even know he had, and pulled out a slip of paper, evenly cut and pristine, not even a wrinkle on it. He held it out to Midoriya, and the teen took it from him gently. Holding it up to his face, it was a phone number. "If you ever need an internship, you've always got one with me. I'd love to have you back." The hero had flashed a thumbs up. "Just, one thing. Toshinori still thinks that he can only reach me by payphone. Keep it that way." Midori had blinked owlishly before stifling a round of laughter that escaped from his throat, pocketing the slip. "Sure thing." Gran Torino nodded his own devious smirk. "Thanks. Now I don't want to keep you any longer. You got a train to catch." He gasped lightly, suddenly remembering his time commitment. "Shoot, yeah." Midori spun on his heels, which made a bad idea in retrospect with his still healing leg, but he still managed. Thank you again, for everything, he called over his shoulder with a wave. He started scrambling down the sidewalk, muttering under his breath about losing track of time. With a little luck, he maybe could get some help from Gami once they were out of sight. He figured they would still be able to make it to the station comfortably. Maybe he could even get Recovery Girl to speed up the healing on his leg. He hated the idea of being stuck walking like this for much longer. Hey, kid! Midori glanced back in surprise, only to see Gran Torino staring at him dumbly. Who are you? Again? Seriously? Gami had slouched roughly at his side. Midori laughed nervously, scratching his face awkwardly. I told you, it's Midori Izu... Gran Torino just shook his head. No, it ain't. It was Midori's turn to stare dumbly this time. If this was some kind of joke, he didn't get it. This was his name. He didn't have any other name. His eyes lit up. It's Owari, the forever hero. This time Gran Torino nodded with a smirk. With a graceful spin, he turned back around and went back into the building, sending him off with a little wave. Midori waved back, even though he knew it wasn't going to be seen. We should really be heading to the train station. The teen jolted again. Shit, we have to go. This is what I have been... Gami sighed. Never mind, just give me your briefcase. Midori promptly handed the case over to his mentor and began speed-walking down the street. Gami followed close behind, easily able to both carry the bag and keep up with the boy's fast pace. Midori would have remarked something of shock or pride if he had the peace of mind to drift off like that, but instead, his thoughts were taken calculating however he could cut time to make it to his station comfortably. He wasn't fully familiar with all the alleys here, but he knew the general direction he was headed, and he was sure that he could manage jumping a fence or two if necessary. His legs screamed otherwise, but he'd had worse. You know, I'm not really sure how to feel about him after everything. Who? The teen panted. Gran Torino. Gami rolled his eyes, but otherwise bit back a snarky remark. He went from a senile elder to an uninterested ratbag to a slightly more interested ratbag, and then suddenly to a doting caretaker. Just do not know what to make of him. And then whatever just now was. People are just complicated, Gami. Midori shrugged, almost obviously, recalling his call with Ida the night before, recalling his fight alone against the hero killer, recalling his talk with Hiyori Ryoyami, what seemed like ages ago. People are more complex than just black or white. It's part of being human. Being confusing. Midori huffed teasingly. You act like you weren't human once. Gami's grip on the briefcase nearly gave out, but he recovered so quickly it wasn't noticed. I guess what I mean is, how do you decide who to trust? If everyone is good and bad, can't they all hurt you? The teen's pace slowed unconsciously, something of a pout growing on his face. I mean, realistically, I guess they all can. His lips pursed tightly. I was never the best judge of character. They were in front of the station now, with more than the occasional passerby every now and then, but Midoriya either didn't notice or didn't care. There's no proven science for any of this. There's no way to know if someone you trust might hurt you. You're not going to be able to get anywhere when your record says quirkless. You'll just be spinning in circles until you've lost all energy to keep going. Or if someone you don't never will. You're a much truer hero than I gave you credit for. I guess at the end of the day, I just trust my heart, as corny as it sounds. I won't be right all the time, maybe not even as often as I think, but the alternative would be to never trust anyone at all. And that is bad? Now it was Midori's turn to roll his eyes, but his pal shifted to a small smile. Well, for one, we wouldn't be together as the greatest hero duo Japan will ever see. Gami gasped aloud. Without trusting anyone, there's no one to have your back when you're in trouble. You'd be facing everything alone, and while that might work for a little bit, you'll always give out when it matters most, and that's just the end. Midoriya paused. This is my fault, so please, let me accept the punishment I rightfully deserve. Gami paused. You really mean that? I don't want you to stay if that makes you unhappy. You're my friend, Gami. I just want you to be happy. I think I understand. Gami dropped the briefcase as they made it past the ticket booth and treaded deeper into the station. Does that mean you trust Gran Torino? They arrived at their gate, boarded not long after, or maybe it was longer than either of them realized. It had been quite the morning, after all. His successor chuckled. After everything, yeah, I do. The train left the station with a screech. The duo didn't talk much after that. Midori barely focused on the oddity of Gami riding in the train car alongside him. Really, many of his thoughts were still stuck on how incredibly lucky everything had turned out. They'd all gotten a pretty nasty scare from the hero killer, to say the least, but he didn't think either Todoroki or Ida truly understood how close things had come to a total disaster that night. Even now, from the safety of a train ride home, his hands shook lightly on his lap. And not from the remnants of a blast. The price of always being worried about loved ones, he supposed. But if this was what worrying resulted in, everything miraculously turning out all right, even by the skin of his teeth, then he had no issue doing it time and time again. He loved them, as terrifyingly vulnerable as it was, and suddenly he understood maybe a part of the reason why Gami wanted to hold him close and never let him go. I think we are starting to pull into the station. Midori blinked. Already? That was fast. Fast? What are you? Gami shifted in confusion. Are you feeling all right? You must have been lost in thought for a while. The train began its piercing halt. I guess so. The teen sighed with something of a fortunate smile on his face, reaching out to grab Gami's hand in a way that he hadn't for a long time. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you and everyone else in my life. I'd almost forgotten how nice it feels to love people. Gami repressed a small shudder, but the ill feeling was quickly consumed on its own as the ghost had squeezed his hand back. Me too. Gami carefully helped him to his feet as the train doors opened and Midoriya had returned to balancing his briefcase and his crutch. The station was ungodly busy, and the duo could only hope that they'd find an empty spot so Gami could carry the briefcase for a bit. But among the rush and the liveliness, Midori couldn't help but feel just a little lost. Are we supposed to be meeting a Razorhead somewhere, or are we meant to travel home by ourselves? Midori frowned. I don't think we ever talked about it, and of course I don't have his number, so I can't call and ask. There he is, over there! The two perked up, only to see what had to be Present Mike, disguised in the most poorly fashioned costume he'd ever seen, barreling straight toward him. He wasn't prepared in the slightest, as he was scooped into a tight hug, dropping his briefcase and nearly his crutch out of shock. Oh, we are so glad you're safe, Yamada exclaimed, though through his many layers, it was so muffled that Midori almost had missed it. Aizawa strolled up just as the voice hero pulled away. You're drawing a lot of attention, Zashi. Kinda defeats the whole point of the outfit. Midori sputtered, still completely baffled. Aizawa-sensei, Yamada-sensei, I'm confused. Gran Torino called me after you, Ida, and Todoroki were admitted to the hospital. How he got my number, I have no idea. If I were to guess, it had to be through All Might. Aizawa then turned off to the side, almost in shame, but Midori recognized that look of regret anywhere. I can't believe you never had our numbers. I can't believe we didn't give them to you. And all the time that we've been together should have been the first thing we did. Yamada touched his hand on Aizawa's shoulder, in the same gentleness as Gami was holding his hand right now. Well, we're fixing that right now, Sho, so this'll never happen again. He then turned to Midori again. If you could pass your phone real quick, we just want to make sure that you always have us when you need us. I can take that from you, too. You're holding on to a lot right now. He was, and so he let it go. I'm sorry about running into danger again. The guilt consumed him as he handed over his phone and the briefcase. I just knew Ida was going to, and I had to keep him safe, and I know I should have told Gran Torino about everything, but I was just scared. Yamada touched his hand in the same gentleness as he did before. I get it, Midori. We wish you hadn't, but we get why you did. We just want to make sure that you never have to do it alone again. The teen rubbed the water in his eyes with Gami's sleeve as he refused to let go of his hand, though the ghost wasn't too bothered. All done. Shouldn't be too hard to find Zashi and I in your contacts now. Aizawa handed his phone back. Nezu's in there too, at his insistence. Midori sniffled, his lips curling into a shaky smile. You should see what happened to my costume, at his insistence. Aizawa shook his head, but the motion was more playful than anything else. Always messing where he doesn't belong. Tell me about it, Yamada laughed. The voice hero's bubbly laugh must have been contagious, because soon they were all laughing, and finally, for the first time since the whole fiasco had started, Midori felt his guilt in his heart finally settle into sweet, true relief. Aizawa took his backpack from him, and he could walk a little easier that way, ruffling his hair a bit as he had pulled back, but his hand remained threaded through his locks just a bit longer than it should have, in the same way as when Gami needed to make sure that he was really there. Midori couldn't help but feel just a bit disappointed when it eventually left. Ready to go home? Everything really was okay again. Yeah, let's go home. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 43 of Deku and Death. Chapter 44 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.